campus politics are very far to the left. They're not liberal. They're progressive far left, okay? And the basic coalition which dominates campus life is a coalition of the oppressed and the oppressor, okay? And the number one oppressed group, of course, is blacks. Now, a lot of these blacks, their mother is a plastic surgeon and the father is a corporate lawyer, but they're oppressed.
Welcome to another episode of Counterculture, the show that stands at the intersection of reason and faith in the battle against sentimentality. Our guest on this edition is an old friend of mine from Chicago, but contrary to the Chicago way of doing things, Charles Lipson is somebody nobody sent. Lipson brings unique wit and wisdom to otherwise conventional, which is to say banal, discussions of partisan politics and keen insights into the global threats to free societies the world over. Lipson is the Peter B. Ritzma Professor of Political Science Emeritus at the University of Chicago, where he founded the program on international politics, economics, and security. He's a contributing writer to Spectator, and you can find his writings on geopolitics and domestic politics alike in many other outlets, including at realclearpolitics.com, but you can get it all for free at charleslipson.com, charleslipson.com. We have much to discuss about the war to eradicate Hamas, the war to repel the Russians, the larger interests of a totalitarian nature named China and Iran, backing both of the unholy actors, or both the unholy actors in the Middle East and Eastern Europe, and America's role in it all. For example, was Israeli Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu correct when he pressed the West to recognize Israel's fight against Hamas is the West's fight as well? Are the comparisons of October 7th to Hitler's Germany, Pearl Harbor, or 9/11 appropriate? We'll also assess how these global conflicts have or have not reshaped the presidential election next year. Is there any prospect of an outcome other than Trump versus Biden versus RFK Jr.? Much to cover with Professor Charles Lipson, the pride of Marks, Mississippi. Professor, thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you. Thank you. You and I both remember the origin of that we don't want nobody sent.
Oh, sure we do.
Phrase.
Yeah. Yes, we do.
It was actually somebody years and years ago in my own department, that of political science at the University of Chicago, who wanted to embed himself within the Chicago political machine so he could write a dissertation about it. And the guy he volunteered to help was part of the machine and just couldn't understand him and said, well, who sent you? And he said, nobody. And he said, well, what do you want? Meaning like a job on a sanitation truck. And he said, well, I don't want anything. And this was just incomprehensible to a Chicago way guy. And he said, in the end, he finally came up with the answer, we don't want nobody sent. And that became the title of the book written by Milton Rakoff.
Milton Rakoff,
now
sure.
Deceased. And his son is actually one of the most prominent scholars of the American Revolution and early American history at Stanford University.
I didn't know that part of the background, but that's fun. All right, so
yeah.
I hate to start our discussion with a personal attack, but you did do your undergraduate at Yale, and you did get advanced degrees at Harvard. So I before we get into geopolitics, I want to talk a little bit about campus politics, since that's where you spent so much of your career on a college campus, University of Chicago.
Well, you can see how those schools have gone downhill since I left, right?
There's no question. It's right. There's strong correlation, if not causation, I'm sure. But I mean, are you surprised at what you've seen happen? The sort of really disgusting behavior. I mean, that young engineering student who was just arrested at Cornell,
right?
A National Merit Scholar. The sorts of things that he was saying online, I'm quoting him: rape and kill all the Jew women before they birth more Jew Hitlers. I mean, his parents said, well, he was depressed. That's not really who he is. I don't know how that's really. I'd like to see the line from depression to the sort of threats he was making, that sort of rhetoric. That is learned. And you're talking, the best and the brightest, this engineering student, National Merit Scholar. He was mentoring other engineering students at Cornell. Are you surprised at what has crawled out from underneath the rock in the Ivy Leagues at elite schools like my alma mater, Northwestern, Stanford, NYU? Are you surprised?
I was deeply disturbed by what has happened on campus and am deeply disturbed, but I would have been more surprised 10 years ago. What we've seen over the past 10 years or so is a rising amount of anti-Semitism. But I want to tell you what I think it's grounded in. I think it was actually after the Hamas attacks and the pro-Palestinian groups got out in support. I think all barriers to even saying those things out loud had been knocked down. And so you begin to see students saying things that they would never say. I mean, and we've seen all over America and all over Europe uh, people tearing down posters of people who had been taken hostage and so forth. I mean, that's just the vilest kind of action. On campus, and this is very important to understand, campus politics are very far to the left. They're not liberal, they're progressive far left, okay? And the basic coalition which dominates campus life is a coalition of the oppressed and the oppressor, okay? And the number one oppressed group, of course, is blacks. Now, a lot of these blacks, their mother is a plastic surgeon and the father is a corporate lawyer, but they're oppressed. And the number one international oppressed group that's part of the coalition is the Palestinians and Muslims more generally. Again, their parents may be oil barons, or whatever they are. It doesn't matter. They're all part of this coalition. And then, of course, it includes gays, transsexuals, all the rest. It's a coalition that is fundamentally based on two principles. One is we don't talk about any positive goals, because as soon as we talk about positive goals, let's say gay rights, then the group would split, because you see people with a sign that says something like Queers for Palestine, and you say, yeah,
Right.
march with that sign through any Muslim majority state and you would be killed. So they can't, reproductive rights, abortion rights, whatever you want to call it, equality for women, all of those things would split apart the group. And then the second thing is it's what you and I are familiar with as a key in American politics, a log roll, right? I'll support you if you'll support me. In America, the classic one of those is, and it's just a tactical coalition. What we're against is called the Baptists and Bootleggers Coalition, right? The Baptists were against the legalization of liquor because they thought it was wrong to drink liquor. The bootleggers were against it because they didn't want a competitor selling legal liquor. They wanted people to drink. They didn't want what the Baptists wanted. They wanted people to drink. They just didn't, well, they wanted them to drink bootleg liquor. So that's what we have on campus, but it is so dominant. And who are the oppressors here? The oppressors are essentially white middle class students, but they could also be Asian students or, whatever. It doesn't matter.
This is where
The
allyship comes in.
That's right. That's right. And they can make an alliance with this group of the oppressed under a couple of conditions. One is they have to admit that they are responsible for all the evils of American history, which they all see as a parade of horribles, right? That's why history for them begins in 1619, project, that sort of thing. And the other is they don't have agency. The leaders of the group have to be these other people, and it's really an invidious coalition. And I would say one more thing about it. The idea that we've had in Anglo-Saxon legal culture for a millennium is that you, Dan Proft, are responsible for your actions. You're not responsible for your father's actions. You're not responsible for your brother's actions, unless you were directly involved in them, right? But that's not what these people are saying. They're saying you're responsible for everyone else in the world named Proft. You may be responsible for all, whatever your religion is, whatever your race is. This is so you're grouped into these identity groups, and then the identity groups are pitted against each other, and their identity overrides what is common about us as Americans. You, Dan, and I don't even know your religion, right? But uh, uh, you and I are common as Americans. I have my friend John Cass, and I talk about this all the time because his father came over from Greece, and he's proud of
Mm-hmm.
being Greek. There's nothing wrong with that, being Greek
Right, of
American.
course.
But he's an American, first of all, and we've lost that common sense.
Yeah, I mean, the Thomas Sowell formulation on this is so great. I'm responsible for what people did who died before I was born, but other people who are quote unquote oppressed aren't responsible for what they do right now in real time, in real life. It's that sort of dichotomy and silliness that pervades college campuses. But I want to go to this moment recently where the governor of the state of New York, Kathy Hochul, is holding a press conference at Cornell decrying the specific threats of violence against Jewish students on campus. And the Cornell University president is standing there, looking, equally indignant and so on and so forth. And there's an assortment of students and staff there too. I mean, Cornell University, you have to stand there and watch the governor of the state in which your school is located explain the most vile, disgusting type of conduct that's happening at what is supposed to be one of the great institutions of higher learning in the Western world. And nobody's embarrassed. Nobody thinks, well, how did we get to this place? The university president isn't standing next to Governor Hochul saying, I can't believe I'm here. What did we unleash on this campus such that I'm standing here listening to a politician give what should be a grammar school lecture on how you treat other people who are different than you? And it's just beyond the grasp of a certain segment of this student body. What are we doing at Cornell? Those are questions that are not being asked.
That's exactly right. I'm glad you mentioned grammar school, because what happened, the ideology on which all of this is based, really began in universities, some in Europe, some in America, some from immigrants from Europe to America, uh, and spread from the humanities to the soft social sciences like anthropology and so forth. The anthropology convention uh, just uh, just blocked a
Right.
panel on whether there were biological sexes. It would have hurt the feelings of some members. Uh, but it spread to high schools. It's pervasive at places like the University of Chicago Lab School, New Trier, and its equivalents in Scarsdale and Shaker Heights around Cleveland and places like that. And now it's gone down to middle schools. At the lab school, there's a sign on the playground that all the children are supposed to read as they go in, that the land was stolen from Indians. So there's this kind of guilt about our history, some of which was just dreadful history. I mean, it's true the Indians were exterminated. It's true there was slavery, then Jim Crow laws, then discrimination, which ended in the mid 1960s. I should say that um, we lived with my great grandfather, who had actually been in the Tsar's army and escaped from Russia in 1890. You were when you were drafted in the Tsar's army, you were drafted for 25 years. You were legally declared dead. Your wife could remarry. Uh, by the 1950s, the same length of time from his immigration to America, um, to that period as we are from the civil rights laws of the mid 60s, our whole family, generations of the family, were sort of ordinary middle class citizens and accepted as such in our community. Now, there was still discrimination against blacks, and it was invidious and terrible in that era, especially in the South where I grew up. But we're 60 years beyond that. And and whatever strategies we've been pursuing have been partially successful. We now have a black middle class community that never existed in those numbers before, but we also have a real breakdown in parts of the black community. And we have a real breakdown on campus where the effects of affirmative action have been almost entirely negative.
Um, Ayan Hirsi Ali, who's at the Hoover Institution, she's a anti-Islamist activist. She was brutalized as a child in Kenya. She talked recently about how hate is indoctrinated, and she recalled her time as a teenager in Kenya,
Hmm.
where the Muslim Brotherhood movement was afoot and other similarly situated Islamist
Right.
movements. And it was drilled into their heads over and over again to hate Jews, to wish death on Israel, and so on and so forth. And she said, that hate can obviously be unlearned. It was for her, clearly, but it takes some doing. And she made the comparison to the hate associated with the new Marxists who dominate college campuses and most of our cultural and civic institutions, as we've seen in full blossom over the last several weeks since the October 7th terrorist attack by Hamas. And she basically said, look, America needs to get about uh, derailing this woke, as it's called, this woke movement that is unapologetic, as you were describing, unabashed, woefully ignorant, and terribly dangerous. And it was just interesting to hear her talk about her childhood being exposed to the Muslim Brotherhood movement and then making that comparison to wokeism on college campuses and elsewhere in the West.
You are so right. Let me tell you a story, literally from yesterday. I was at a major fundraising event taken there because it honored some people I knew and so forth, not because I necessarily uh, wanted to be there for other reasons. And one of the people who was there was a bank vice president, clearly there because she was in charge of something like community relationships or something like that. They needed her in the C-suite. Um, and she ended her, uh, I want to come back in a second to how she ended her talk. Her talk ended with a quote from Angela Davis. This is
Oh,
bank.
wow. Sure.
Okay.
Communist
Now it
banker.
gets better. It gets better. It gets better. Communist leader, supporter still to this day of everything that the North Vietnamese did and so forth. The next speech, the keynote speech, was actually a very moving and great speech by a woman who is now a candidate astronaut, but she had been an undergraduate at Harvard. and in physics, which is unusual for a woman. And she had her family had escaped, harrowing escape from Vietnam. Their little boat was fired at by machine guns and all the rest. And I noticed two things. One, nobody, including the woman who quoted Angela Davis, had any thought that the harrowing escape we were told about, and that clearly scarred her family and shaped it, and some of the people died in the escape and so forth, that the people who were firing the machine guns were the ones were being supported by Angela Davis, who had just been lovingly quoted. And the second thing was that although this woman had received all the benefits of being an American and coming to America, and her family striving to come to America, she never really said anything positive about the country itself, right? She talked about her own struggles and some laws that she had helped get passed, which were good laws, and she had done important things. And she may well love the country, but she never said it. And so I was just struck by all these elements that have now become absolutely commonplace in elite educated culture. A kind of embarrassment about American history, an embarrassment about the culture, grouping everybody into these identity groups, pitting the groups against each other, and saying that you are responsible for acts for which you were not responsible. Let me, one final point. There's a lot of talk about privilege. Let me ask you, Dan, what do you think privilege really is?
Well, I mean, what it actually is versus how it's defined by the left.
No. Yeah, we know how it's defined. What do you think it is?
What I actually think it is, I mean, I always think things through the Chicago political context. It's just sort of how I'm hardwired now.
Yeah.
But what I think it is somebody who gets a special deal, a waiver, something that is given to them that is not merit-based. It's relationship or identity-based.
That is right. Now, let me, or at least I agree with it. Let me ask you a different question, but a related one. To the extent that you feel that you've been privileged in your own life, Dan, what has been the privilege that you've been given?
Being lucky enough to be raised by a two-parent loving family who sacrificed for me so I could access the opportunities to earn a quality education, having mentors and in the form of coaches and teachers and professors that helped me along the way, having friends that opened doors of opportunity once I was sort of in the arena of politics and media. So I mean, it's all the I guess it's the opportunities that are attendant to living in a free society and being fortunate enough to be raised in a proper God-fearing household, and all of the opportunities for intellectual, social, emotional development that flow from that.
I couldn't agree more. I completely agree. When I think of my own privileges, those are the things I think of, and I would say one more, which is I was raised in a safe community. I didn't have to fear every time I went outside. I think those are privileges that could extend throughout society, and many of the people, in fact, the woman who gave the keynote speech, who was a Vietnamese refugee, I'm sure those were the privileges that she experienced, the real privileges. She didn't get any extra benefit in getting into Harvard. She was probably had to overcome bias against her. Asian Americans typically do.
Sure.
I know.
Plus the Supreme Court case, right?
Right. I mean, so that's I mean, I think we need to get back to those basic values. Those, I mean, I'm not saying that, I mean, certainly people who have income below the poverty level, who don't know from this week to next week whether they can heat their house, they really are in trouble and they need help and they've been denied. Perhaps they've been denied. They may be responsible for their own situation, but not. We've lost the whole concept of the undeserving poor, right? I mean, we nobody would ever use the word deserving poor anymore, right? And that's a loss. I mean, because what it means is that no longer are people held responsible for for their own conduct and for the results of that conduct. But I would say that the privileges that you, Dan Proft, had and the privileges that I had didn't come from inheriting John D. Rockefeller's fortune. They came from,
unfortunately.
yeah, no, well, those, I saw a lot of those people over the years. I saw them as an undergraduate at Yale. I saw them, you didn't see them in graduate school at Harvard, that's for sure. You saw them as undergraduates, right? And when I went to Yale, it was really divided into two groups. One were people who had Roman numerals after their name, you know, and they had all gone to the best prep schools and had chauffeurs. And then the other group, I would say, was the son of the best orthodontist in Scarsdale.
Right, right. Well,
And,
you know, but just on that point, you at Yale,
yeah.
I mean, you're a Jewish gentleman, so I mean, just to
From the
compare and
heart of
contrast,
Jewish life in America, from the heart of Jewish life in America,
Marx,
March,
Mississippi.
Mississippi. Yeah.
Of course. But your experience, I mean, it's not like anti-Semitism is something new, but the experience you had at Yale, for example, as compared to what you're seeing Jewish students in the Ivy League experience right now.
Oh, it's completely different. There may have been, you know, a kind of white collar um, discrimination, but even that, A, it was embarrassed to say its name, and B, it was fading. You know, I mean, it was, um, but you know, if you look at what happened to Jews in America, the children of the immigrants, it wasn't just that they studied hard and went up the ladder and so forth. It's that their parents wanted them to play baseball. They wanted them to become an American. They didn't want them to speak Yiddish, right? And that was true for, I mean, you know, John Cass didn't grow up speaking Greek in America. He, you know, he grew up as an American, and that's what the parents wanted, and they wanted their children to integrate. And it is true there was a lot of discrimination in an earlier era, and may have, and there was still some discrimination. There were country clubs and
Sure.
downtown clubs that didn't accept Jews or blacks and so forth. But it was the real fear when I was growing up was from the Ku Klux Klan. Um, and you know, this sort of populist, redneck, very aggressive, lower middle class whites who were angry at everybody who wasn't like them and thought that that the country was going to hell because of blacks and Jews and immigrants and all the rest. But you didn't see that at Yale. You didn't see that at Harvard.
And now it's coming from the professorate. Forget the students for a second. It's coming from the professorate in the Ivy League. I mean, maybe not in total, but it's more than just one-offs when you have 100 professors at Columbia sign a letter running interference for a bunch of students that were effectively singing the praises of Hamas. I mean, so I mean that is just a sea change, and it's I mean, and it's been going on for a long time, and there have been plenty of examples and plenty of ink spilled about these radical professors on campus that spew nonsense and hateful nonsense at that, and it didn't rise to the attention of Ken Griffin for the first $500 million he donated to Harvard. It didn't rise to the attention of Bill Ackman. It didn't rise to the attention of John Huntsman, but it has now. And so the question is, okay, is this just a moment where everybody's covering their backsides a little bit, or do you see, the possibility at least of a real reckoning on college campus? Whether it relates to donors, whether it relates to federal funding, whether it relates to legislation to stop Qatar from providing so much funding to these universities. What do you think?
I think all of those are happening. And I would add, I think that parents are becoming very concerned about which college their students go to, their children go to, and they can see what's happened at Berkeley, at Michigan, at Yale, at Harvard, at Stanford, and so forth. At Stanford, there was an instructor who grouped all the Jewish students into one corner to make them feel Palestinian. That person was expelled, but how could such a person even think of doing that? That wouldn't have happened.
How could they get a job at Stanford? How could they get a job at Stanford?
I'll tell you, the donor class of these universities is now deeply concerned, and rightly so. Now, there are other donors, the Tides Foundation, the George Soros types. They haven't. They are the people who've been donating to all these racial justice DAs, so-called. The one in New Orleans was carjacked with his mother in the car 2 weeks ago. The one in Oakland was just broken into. And when I posted something about that in social media, one person told me that his car had been broken into. The same thing. He'd rented a car in San Francisco. It had been broken into and his laptop stolen. And when he returned the car to the rental agency, they said, we get about, the police told him, don't even bother reporting this. We have so many, don't even bother. And when he returned the rental car, they said, we get about 20 a week like this from his rental agency, not from all rental agencies, but just from his, Hertz or Avis or whatever it was. I mean, this breakdown of law and order under the grounds that somehow it's social justice is just perverse. Going back to colleges, I think that the real obstacle here will be the following. We believe that the English department should not be told who to hire. That the professors in that department should be allowed to make their own hiring choices subject to the laws of the United States. They can't say we will not hire a white person or something. That's discrimination. Or at least it would be.
They can't say it out loud.
They can't say it out loud, actually. And you're seeing actually in the aftermath, that's a great point, because you're seeing in the aftermath of the Harvard decision about affirmative action, you're seeing universities figuring out the various ways to get around it. For example, they've almost all made SAT scores voluntary. You don't have to submit them, and they've skewed their essay writing questions in ways that are designed to let them find out who you are. How did my background as an oppressed person qualify me for?
What have you overcome?
Yeah, what have you overcome? Let's all sing together. So so there are problems that are twofold. One is with the faculty. The other, if you're not inside the university, you might not see it, but the administrators in most universities are as far left, further left even than the faculty. And therefore, it's not to say that universities are thoroughly corrupted by this. The sciences are still good. um, but a degree in anything, any major that has the word studies in it is almost worthless.
I wanted to scale this conversation to the international stage now, and it folds right into what Benjamin Netanyahu said in the speech that he gave, which was really directed at the West, saying that our existential fight against Hamas to eradicate this terrorist scourge is your fight in the West. Do you agree that that is the case? And do you think that he was talking about the sort of insidious elements in free societies like we're talking about in America, like he's dealing with in Gaza and the West Bank for that matter?
I think so, but then I would, right? I believe in the values of Western civilization. In fact, I taught a course. I'm an international relations specialist, and those were what most of my courses were on, including I always used to teach an international history courses. But over the last decade or so of my teaching, I began to teach a seminar called Core Western Values, and it allowed students who had at the University of Chicago, where I taught, had taken courses in their first and second year, freshman and sophomore year. They had taken courses with where they read Karl Marx, Max Weber, Emil Durkheim, all the sort of great social thinkers. But then they had gone on and majored in history or economics or political science or whatever, English. And then some of them wanted to come back, I thought, to those big issues. And at the time, you could still get people who had diverse views on those issues. And so we had a course in which we talked about 1 week would be free speech, another would be religious toleration, another would be government by elected representatives of your own choosing, things like that, things that we consider very basic. Uh, and this point about diverse views is very, very important. Um, you just benefit enormously from having people, even if your views are quote correct, you benefit enormously from having somebody say, well, why would you possibly say that? What's your evidence? What's
Absolutely.
the basis for your saying that? And if you never hear that, you're losing something in your education. And I would say that that's the most fundamental difference, really, between today's progressives and yesterday's true liberals. I don't mean liberals, Teddy Kennedy liberals. I mean liberals like an Adlai Stevenson or Dwight Eisenhower or even a Richard Nixon or a Jack Kennedy or whatever. Those people believed that alternative views had a right to be heard and that they would be better off by engaging them and that the public could listen, engage, and benefit from that engagement. That's just
Well,
something you don't see on college campuses.
I mean, I remember when I was an undergrad. I mean, now it's some time ago now, but not that long ago. Phyllis Schlafly and Sarah Weddington did debates around the country on college campuses about abortion. G. Gordon Liddy and Timothy Leary were doing debates of sorts, more like a vaudeville act, but still debates on drug legalization, crime control, border security. I mean, this is almost 3 decades ago now, and you don't
Wouldn't happen.
really see
Wouldn't
that.
happen.
You don't see that
Yeah,
today.
that's right. I can remember a debate when I was an undergraduate between Bill Buckley and William Sloane Coffin. For those who don't remember William Sloane Coffin, he was one of the most prominent religious figures supporting all the kind of liberal movements of the mid 1960s. He came from a very distinguished, wealthy New York family. And he spoke with a lisp, and I can still remember, but he was a great speaker, and I can still remember him saying, Bill Buckley with 2 years behind me at Yale, and he has been falling steadily further back. And the crowd loved it. And we
Right.
understood it was entertainment, but we also understood that they were debating real issues. And I think the biggest issue uh, uh, now that I think that, let me go into a controversial issue, which is affirmative action. I actually think that when you treat people differently on the basis of race, that that undermines a very basic American principle. But that in the first years after you had ended the Jim Crow laws and discriminatory education and so forth, Americans are a practical people. And we said, this, you can't just say at this point, having held these people down for so long, now let's everybody race on the same level. But the problem was once you get that never faded away, and that once you give people special benefits, you build around them political organizations and interests that want to perpetuate them. And that's exactly what has happened. And it's not just that the losers in that are um, the white students or the Asian students who weren't admitted to Harvard as a result or something like that. It's also the students who were given a quote leg up and admitted, but who were admitted knowing secretly by the people who admitted them that they were expected to finish in the lower quarter of the class. And we know what's happened to them. Now, it didn't happen to all of them. Some of them rose well above where they were expected to finish. But what happened to a lot of them is that they came in hoping to major in the sciences so they could become doctors. And we have data on that from Duke University, where an extensive study was made, where about the same number of whites and blacks came in wanting to major in the sciences, and a small number of whites actually ended up switching out of that major for whatever reason. It was too hard, or they didn't like it, or they liked English or history more, whatever the reason, they didn't major in that. But a huge number of the African Americans switched out of those science majors. And that perhaps, almost certainly actually, because had they gone to a university where, had they gone to a university, let me stop for a second. I had another of these calls. This, I apologize, Dan. I
No,
should
it's
have
all right.
moved all my phones out of the room.
It's all right.
Had these students gone to a university, any university, where they were expected to be, before admission, where they were expected to be around the middle of the class, they would have been able to pursue their majors and and make steps toward the future that they had in mind for themselves. But they were put into the wrong schools and asked to compete where the people who had admitted them expected them to do poorly, right? This is like asking somebody who is a welterweight to fight against a heavyweight. It's not a fair fight. And and the result of this has been not just that those students were denied um, a future that they had sought. It's that they became angry about it, and understandably so. And there's a lot of self segregation on campus as a result. These students band together, and you can see it in lunch and dining halls. So, a lot of the goals, the so called diversity goals, were not actually met. And I should add that diversity for these DEI people, diversity, equity, and inclusion, has never included diverse ideas. They just mean skin color.
I wanted
It's
to
really invidious.
I wanted to lean on your expertise in the geopolitical arena and talk a little
Right.
bit more about the positioning of America vis-a-vis Ukraine, vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis Taiwan, because of course we have this debate raging in this country about ongoing, and particularly with Ukraine, since this is 18 months in, open-ended military aid to Ukraine, and now what the sort of establishment in D.C. is attempting to do is Ukraine is linked to Israel, is linked to Taiwan, and we need to be providing the support to our allies in keeping what animatronic Anthony Blinken calls our strategic rivals. That's generous. In keeping basically Russia, China, and Iran and that axis, keeping them at bay and keeping them from developing stronger ties. So where do you come down in the proposal to group this all together as complementary aspects of advancing America's national security interests?
Well, let me just say that I am back from Taiwan. I did a trip there in which I met with the former president. I met with the former head of the Navy there and spent some time talking with them about their strategic issues. My advice to them was to move the island further away from China. Uh,
Yes. Okay, Hank Johnson. Yeah.
yeah, I'm glad you remembered that. He literally asked if we moved all of our troops to the side of one island, if it would tip the island
Guam.
over.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, Guam,
Hmm.
I believe that was the single dumbest thing ever said in a public setting anywhere. But in any event, uh, first of all, uh, I differ from many conservatives in having strong support for Ukraine. I would say that the money that we're sending there is mostly spent in the United States, and I think it's a very legitimate concern that there's corruption there. There's still corruption. I just hope it doesn't affect the Biden family. Uh, but uh,
God
but
forbid.
God forbid. But I don't. I actually think that given that Russia is one of our major, or had been one of our major strategic rivals in the world, that letting them win that war, which is now a war of attrition, a question of who can stay in it the longest, letting them win would be very bad for us and be very costly over the medium term, medium and long term, costly geopolitically and costly in financial terms. Uh, on the on the issue of Israel,
Well, wait, just
is
hold on Ukraine. Just hold on Ukraine.
yeah,
So your
yeah,
colleague, John Mearsheimer, has a
right.
bit of a different opinion, and I just want you to respond to it because he's getting a lot of discussion because he is running contrary to the foreign policy establishment here. He essentially argued a couple things. He feared escalation in Ukraine could come in two forms. One, Russia losing and Putin being desperate and having received the signal from the West that if he used nuclear weapons, the West would not respond with nuclear weapons, that he would be tempted to use nuclear weapons. Now that's not coming to pass right now because of this war of attrition that you're describing, which he agrees with. Now he's concerned, although he characterizes it as a remote possibility at present, that if this drags on, and with Russia's superior numbers, both in terms of manpower and armaments, if this drags on, that there's the possibility that America would directly engage if it's seen that Ukraine can't hold the line, because politically speaking, at minimum, it would be just too much of an embarrassment to have invested this effort into Ukraine and then to see Putin run roughshod. And so he's concerned, again, he says it's a remote possibility, but concerned that direct involvement would mean U.S. boots on the ground. How do you respond to those concerns of escalation that expressed by Mearsheimer, who believes that Ukraine really is not in a position to win a war of attrition?
I don't. I, I disagree with them, and I also disagree with John's basic point, which is that he holds the West and the United States responsible for this war. I hold Putin responsible. And I hold the Obama administration responsible for doing nothing after the 2014 invasion, which gave a signal which was reinforced. I mean, remember, Biden was in charge of our policy in Ukraine at the time. That was what all the corruption stories were about, involving him and his family, his son. But after the President Biden's inept and catastrophic withdrawal from Afghanistan, the Russians and the failure of the United States to do anything as Russia built up 100,000 plus troops on the border of Ukraine over a year before the invasion. Ukraine got the message that the Russia got the message that the Biden administration would not do anything to deter them. And in fact, that was the message that Joe Biden gave to Volodymyr Zelensky when he said, "I'll give you a ride out of the country." And Zelensky famously replied, "I need ammunition, not a ride." I think that the issue of whether or not Ukraine can stay in a war of attrition depends entirely on America not taking John Mearsheimer's advice to get out of the war. I mean, it's a question. I do think that there's a serious problem about how you negotiate an end to the war, and I think that the real danger comes over Crimea, because that's the crux of the conflict. Ukraine can't be rebuilt without taking Crimea. And Russia really does consider Crimea a part of Russia, and they don't want Ukraine to take it. But I support the war. I don't think American troops will get involved there unless the Russians decide to escalate the war by directly attacking NATO allies. The Biden administration has been very careful, indeed, I would argue too careful and too slow in giving Ukraine the various weapons it needed to win earlier. But America gets tired of wars. People don't remember that support for fighting the Second World War ebbed over time during the war.
Well, I spoke with Bradley Bowman, who's a former Pentagon official. He's with the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, and he has your position as well. But he said, look, it's a small price to pay to impose huge costs on Russia, which Ukraine has. But this is not going to be won or advanced even for some time. This is a slog. And he used the time frame 5 to 10 years.
I hope
so
he's
talking
wrong.
about, yeah, well, exactly, and talking about how popular support for these sorts of things ebbs. But I mean, if that is the play, and if that's what's realistic, and some level of honesty, sort of best worst case scenarios would be appreciated because we get so little from inside the Beltway, and which also results in the loss of popular support for providing support. But is the play then, if that's what you think is going to happen, it's 5 or 10 years, it's a slog, it's a war of attrition, we need to continue to provide the weaponry for the Ukrainians to impose a cost. Is this all to get Russia at some point in the indeterminate future to the negotiating table so some sort of armistice can be reached? Or is this still the end game? Because there's no clear definition of what the end game really is from this administration. Is the end game to fully repel the Russians out of Ukraine? It seems to me there has to be some sort of statement of objective that's realistic. And then we say, okay, well, what do you believe would be the resources required to achieve that objective? And we just don't get straight answers from this administration on that matter.
There's a reason we don't get the answers other than the fact that when their lips are moving, they're not telling the truth. And that is that the goal of the United States would be different from the goal that any Ukrainian regime could accept.
Hmm.
No Ukrainian regime right now could say we would be willing to negotiate a solution in which Russia gets to keep part of the Donbass, part of eastern Ukraine. Um, and they certainly couldn't get away with saying we give up our goal of retaking Crimea. Uh, but
But
America
what is
could say that.
realistic? What is realistic? Because obviously, if their ability to sustain the war effort is directly tied to our continued support, then we have leverage at some point.
Right. But first of all, I would say now, fortunately, although the United States is supplying a huge amount, uh, the amount that's being supplied from Europe is now equal to that of America, and that's a good thing. And uh, the main supporters have come from the former communist states of Eastern Europe. They understand the challenge, and but I would say that if Ukraine regains Crimea and regains Zaporizhia and all of Kherson, then the Americans would be more than willing to force negotiations. But the problem not only is a political one in Kiev, the problem would be that you don't want a situation in which the Russians merely consider this a ceasefire and rebuild and start shooting again. That brings us in a way to Israel because that's what the most militant Muslims have always thought of the state of Israel. If you look at the Hamas flag, it shows Palestine on the flag, and there is no Israel. It is all of the state. When you see students marching on campus and they say from the river to the sea, some may be simply ignorant, but the river is the Jordan River, Israel's border with the country of Jordan. The sea is the Mediterranean. A Palestine state from the river to the sea implies the final solution for the Israeli state, its extinction. So Israel has the manpower and the technology to fight on. All they need is some American support. I think that the risk, and everybody knows it, is that Iran will not just use its proxies but come into the fight. And the problem here is clearly, in my opinion, that the Biden administration has an incoherent policy. Their
No
policy
question.
was their policy all along was the extension of the Obama policy. And I don't know if you noticed when Barack Obama finally gave a statement about this 10 days ago or so. And of course, he wagged his finger at the Israelis, don't hurt civilians and so forth, as if the Israelis weren't trying their very best, and the Hamas leaders and so forth hiding themselves under hospitals and behind civilians. But Barack Obama never mentioned Iran. The statement didn't include the word Iran. The administration hardly mentions Iran. And the reason for that is that not just that they don't want to pull the lion's tail, but that they have pursued a policy begun under the Obama administration that said our goal here is to integrate Iran into the Middle East. That was their explicit term, integration. So it's a carrot approach, and it included nothing to deter Iran. Under the Trump administration, I have plenty of problems with the Trump administration's foreign policy, but the Trump administration really cut off the money to Iran. They were down to something like $3 billion in their foreign currency reserves. Under Biden not enforcing any of the sanctions, Iran has something like 70 billion. That's why
Yeah.
all of their proxies now have arms and money and all the rest. And so it is true that the Biden administration has now sent all these carrier forces and other deterrent forces to the region, but they still haven't basically admitted the failure of their old policies, and they as a result of their weakness all over, they are uh, they haven't established a credible deterrent threat that the mullahs in Tehran actually believe. uh, Trump, for all of his faults, really scared the mullahs in Iran. And the first time they killed an American, he went and killed Soleimani. Whereas for 2 weeks, the Iranian proxies have been shelling American bases and apparently causing traumatic brain injuries to some of our soldiers. And we bombed one IRGC base. That's it. That's not a strong response, and it's not likely to communicate. Point is not revenge here. The point is to communicate to Tehran, you keep doing this, you're going to pay a price you don't like.
And so, with that, I mean, it sort of segues into the domestic political question, which is, does what's happening in Ukraine and the Middle East, our relationship with China, does it reshape the presidential election in any material way? Or, given the contrast you're describing between Trump and Biden, does it just solidify those two as their respective parties' nominees? And this is pretty much a fait accompli, and you're going to see a real contrast in terms of the expression of American power globally, at least in discussion during the general election between those two gentlemen. And you can fold in RFK Jr. too if you want.
Well, I do think you've put your finger on a very fundamental element of the debate. Domestic politics always dominates. But I would just say we haven't talked about the risk of a domestic terrorist event. Um, and that, of course, would be a sea change. And it would be a particular sea change because President Biden recklessly just threw open the southern border, where we've now had something like 8 million people come across. And we've had huge numbers of so-called gotaways where we don't even know who came in. And those are not a random sampling of the 8 million who have come in, right? The people who want to get away, who want not to be caught, are likely to have come from the Middle East or maybe from China or whatever, either to spy or to conduct terrorist acts or what have you. I mean, this is a very dangerous situation. And if something grows out of it for which the Biden administration is responsible, they ought to be held responsible for it. And the statement by FBI Director Wray to Congress the other day was chilling. And in fact, he refused to answer the question as to whether the United States was safer now than it had been before Biden took office. So domestic issues will dominate. But uh, uh, Trump reshaped the Republican Party. He made it into a populist party. That had been happening for some time. Reagan began it in some ways. But if you think of the coalition that backed Harry Truman years ago, the kind of working guy who, uh, a kind of lunch bucket at the time, that person is now voting Republican, not Democrat, and that was particularly obvious in a place like West Virginia, which switched almost overnight from being Democratic to Republican. Um, the Democratic Party is now um, the Democratic Party is now a combination of educated urban and suburban elites and the beneficiaries of transfer payments from them. So it has a large minority coalition and so forth. The group that's in play is actually Hispanics. and those will increasingly, I think, become Republican. But foreign policy could be an issue because we're running out of money as well as running out of patience.
He is Charles Lipson, Professor Emeritus of International Relations at University of Chicago. Get all of his writings, charleslipson.com. Professor, great to talk to you. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Dan, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. I hope we can do it again soon.
For sure. Thank you, man. Please like this video and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. And please leave a comment in the comment section. We'd love to hear your thoughts.